Then the wider research community. What could be done there to make it a better, to make it more valuable for policy making and to help filter more of the sort of right kind of information to the people making decisions? The first thing to say is that there's not enough research, and here I will focus on education specifically. There's not enough research on the levers that are actually available to politicians. So there's a fairly decent amount of research on something like assessment for learning, or feedback in lessons. And for teachers, there's quite a lot already out there, and the big question is how do we get more people to engage with the existing research a lot of the time. For people who are making policy, there really isn't very much out there. And I kept coming up against policy questions that people wanted answers on and wanted analysis, where there simply wasn't any evidence in this country about the issue we were looking at. So to take an example, structural reform of schools. Sponsored academies have been a really big policy priority for both the last government and for the current government. Whether you think they should or shouldn't have been, they have been. But there's very little evidence about their effectiveness, despite the policy being 10 or 11 years old. Whereas in America, where you have charter schools, which are a similar concept, you have hundreds of papers, and this isn't completely scientifically accurate, but this is what I sort of could find looking around. I reckon there are several hundred at least decent papers on charter school effects, and only 2 on sponsored academies, and they're both from the same department in the LSE. I hope I haven't missed anything out that people think is very valuable. So what I found when I was having to make policy and deal with questions about free schools and sponsored academies and so on, was I became very reliant on the charter school evidence. And that's good that it's there and helpful, but obviously America is a different country, there are different contexts, the environment's different. It's not ideal to be having to focus so much on evidence about another country. And the same is true whatever the big sort of policy issues you're thinking about in this country. What teacher training route to put money into. There are really no good studies. There are some now happening, but there are no really strong studies on that at the moment. Again, you sort of have to start looking at research that's been done in America in a very different context, with very different recruitment markets and so on. So there's a real capacity problem about the sort of evidence that's of real value to policymakers. And I think we're really missing centres that are focused on questions around education policy as opposed to research and education practice. We don't have, for instance, an equivalent to the King's Fund in health, who are a think tank who are pretty well respected across the board, aren't attached to any party or seen as centre-right or centre-left, and are able to do really useful policy work. Nor do we really have any university departments that are very focused on these questions, though you do have some in some researchers, individual researchers working around the country who are doing really good studies on this sort of thing. So we need more research. And there's a sort of vicious circle which we need to turn into a virtuous circle around capacity in the system to do this kind of research. Just as an example of, the first thing to say is that there's not enough money in education research in this country, but it's only half of the problem. So just as an example of that, on the left you've got the Gates Foundation's Measuring Effective Teachers study, which is a really good piece of work, and I would recommend to anyone who hasn't looked at it to have a look at it. It cost $52 million, that piece of research, that one piece of research. The Gates Foundation funded all of it. In this country, all of those bodies, plus everybody who funds everything in education, spend, I estimate, around $50 million a year in total. So you've got one study versus our entire annual education spend. So we're just not we're not funding enough of this type of research. The Gates Foundation, by the way, spend about £500 million a year in America, just the Gates Foundation, just in America. So money is part of the problem, but it's not the only problem, because the EEF, who are probably the second biggest funder now behind the DfE, may even now be the biggest funder in there of education projects, have already run out of British quantitative researchers that they can give projects to. There aren't any left. They've already used them all up. So we don't have the people to do the work, even if we had the money. There's a real vicious circle that we need to turn into a virtuous one. We need to put more money in, but that money can't just go towards funding projects. It also needs to go toward building capacity, to creating research centres. And whether that can come from government or not is a difficult question, because government is obviously going to have biases about evaluating its own projects. But we don't have philanthropists on the scale of America, so I'm not sure where else it's going to come from. And then just the final point I wanted to make, and I will have a bit of time for a few questions if people have any, is around communication. So there's a capacity issue, but there are lots of people working in education research, in academia and think tanks, and so on. But they're not very good at bypassing the existing filters that politicians have on the whole. There are some very good exceptions to that rule who do interact more directly, and they use modern technology to interact more directly. But it's not commonplace yet. So still, academics tend to focus on academic journals and conference presentations. And those things are important and have their place, but they're very strongly incentivized to focus only on those things. That's where their funding is decided. And not many yet are using social media, especially, to engage directly with politicians and their advisors and senior civil servants. And I still don't think many people realize, because often a lot of them aren't very active tweeters, that pretty much everybody in Westminster uses Twitter all the time. Most ministers use it, most advisors use it. Now, increasingly, senior civil servants are using it as well. And I just find it strange that you'd have people who have spent years often doing some really valuable work that they've sort of sweated blood over. And there's a politician right there that they could just talk to, and they don't. And I just think that still a lot of people don't realize how strong that opportunity is, or how dependent or how much people in Westminster are looking for ways around those traditional filters for information and want to find new ways to think about problems and are searching out for new ideas. There really is a big market for new ideas in all policy spheres, and I think that people need to be more aware of that. So more social media for people involved in the education debate. So I suppose just to bring those various strands together, evidence-based policy is a limited endeavor. We're never going to get past people's underlying values and ideologies, and I don't think it would necessarily be a good thing if we did find a way to do that. It's important to have those kinds of debates. We should be more explicit that we're having those debates rather than pretending that they don't exist. We're also not going to be able to change a lot of the constraints that exist on politicians. We're not going to change the electorate. We're not going to change the way party management works. And we're not going to be able to change the fact that politicians have their own cognitive biases, as we all do. But we can, I think, change the way that they get information and that some of the filters around the way they're getting information. We can make them better educated about their sectors. And we can do that by certainly by improving the way the civil service functions and by accepting that some of its structures are very out of date, that we need to have people who are trained in how to use evidence properly across the board, that when we have really good trained statisticians, we need to be using them to make policy, not using them just to analyse. And we also need to think more about how the research community as a whole can engage better with the centre, directly with politicians, advisors and senior civil servants to get their messages across in a clearer way. So those are my points. I've got, I think, about 10, 15 minutes left if people have any questions.